Bonjour, good morning everyone, good afternoon, ni hao, wherever you are. Thank you for joining us for the next hour and a half for this new IDRI webinar, and the second one we are organizing around reflections on the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on Chinese environmental policies at the domestic level and ambition at the international level. Today's theme revolves around the question of the impacts of the crisis on the wildlife management policies in place in China, but also the question of how this can impact the preparation of the biodiversity COP15 that was supposed to be held this year in October, and which will be most likely postponed to next spring. This is an important question, this linkage between the two, for several reasons. One of them being the powerful symbol that we have a global pandemic that is quite directly linked to a biodiversity issue that started in the country where we were supposed to see an important international meeting, and one that is very important in the history of Chinese environmental diplomacy, nonetheless. So symbolically, it's quite powerful that we are now seeing half of the world confined because of a crisis that started where we're supposed to try and provide an international response to widespread and ongoing biodiversity loss. Secondly, it's not anecdotal because for such environmental meetings, the ambition, the leadership of the host country is an important dimension. It doesn't determine everything, but it's an important ingredient in the success of an environmental meeting. And so understanding what the current situation is creating domestically in terms of dynamics around biodiversity issues is also very important to think whether it can change something on the substance, calendar, ambition of the COP15 preparations. And so we're very lucky to have with us today two speakers who are quite perfect to bring together this conversation, this multi-level conversation. We will start with the presentation by Aaron White, who's from the Environmental Investigation Agency. Aaron has been working for years now on wildlife trade and management, and especially on case studies in China. He has also lived in Beijing, and Aaron will be really focusing on current discussions and developments on policies surrounding the management of wildlife. We hear a lot about it in the media worldwide, but it's sometimes hard to have a grasp around what's going on in the specifics and details of the existing frameworks in China, current developments, and also why it is an issue that is actually quite complex and hard to tackle, and harder than only edicting a ban. But as with many environmental issues, the devil is in the details of implementation. And this is an example that will be quite also illustrative of that. And then we will hear a presentation from Li Shuo from Greenpeace China. We are very happy to have you again with us. Shuo, you were there to talk about climate 2 weeks ago. And now here to discuss what you think of the evolution of the debate around these specific issues surrounding wildlife, but also how you think this can be connected to maybe a reframing or a new narrative around the importance of COP15. We're very, very lucky to have you both. You're both one of the best experts from civil society on these questions and in this field. I will, before I give you the virtual floor, I will just say a few words around how the questions and answers will work for our audience. So we are 247 connected right now. Thank you so much for being here. So you have a Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And so we will have, after the two presentations, a rather large, about half an hour of Q&A. Please type your questions in the chat window. And while our two speakers will be presenting, I will try to synthesize the question and try to do justice to the diversity of the questions that you will have. I will I will transfer the questions, ask them orally to our speakers. And because of issues of bandwidth and so forth, we cannot afford to have everyone take the floor. But we will work through written form on your side, and I will try to be your faithful interpret towards the speakers. And if you came prepared, if you already have questions, please do not hesitate to already type them in. This will facilitate my work. I'll be able to read them on the go, and take them off your mind and focus on what our speakers have to say. So without further ado, Aaron, I will give you the floor first, and then we will hear Shuo. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex. I will just share my screen. Hopefully you can see my presentation.
Perfect on my side.
Great. So thank you very much, everybody. I'm Aaron White. I'm a wildlife campaigner and China specialist at the Environmental Investigation Agency. And today I'm going to be talking about China's wildlife management policies, and in particular, what has changed in the wake of COVID-19, what hasn't changed, and what else still might be decided. The Environmental Investigation Agency is an NGO with offices in London and Washington, DC. We work on a range of environmental issues, climate change and marine plastics, whaling to timber trafficking, deforestation, and wildlife trade and conservation. We have engaged with the process of revising wildlife law in China since 2014, and we've produced multiple recommendations and policy papers on this issue. So to understand what's changed in terms of wildlife policy in China, first we need to understand what the policy was pre-COVID. So to do this, I'm going to look in a little bit of detail at China's wildlife protection law. Translated more literally, this would be the Wild Animal Protection Law. So this law does not cover conservation and trade of plant species. The Wildlife Protection Law is China's most significant piece of legislation relating to the conservation of and trade in terrestrial wild animal species. It was first enacted in 1988 and has been revised a few times since, most significantly in 2016. As we'll come to, the Wildlife Protection Law is going to be revised again this year. While the law nominally covers all wild animal species in China, in practice, the key operative language of the law around hunting, breeding, trade, and consumption is actually mostly concerned with protected species. Now, what a protected species is delineated by the law into various categories, including first and second class special state protection, that is nationally protected species, local protection, and another category called sanyou, that's species of ecological, scientific, or social value. So the special state protection category is the one that most of the law is concerned with. Now, the wildlife protection law in China has long been controversial in environmental circles in that it endorses so-called rational utilization of wildlife as well as wildlife protection, and mechanisms for commercial breeding and trade, even of protected species, are written into the language of the law. Firstly, let's consider how non-protected species are managed under the law, given the vast majority of wild animal species in China don't fall under the category of special state protection. So hunting of non-protected species is allowed with a hunting license, and trade, so buying and selling, is permitted with proof of legal origin. That might be a hunting permit or an import permit. The specific text states, anyone who intends to hunt or catch terrestrial wildlife that is not under special state protection shall obtain a hunting license. So even for protected species, the sale, purchase and use of wild animal species is permitted where, and here I'll quote the law in Article 27, when necessary for scientific research, captive breeding, public exhibition or performances, heritage conservation, or other special purposes. Now, in practice, these special purposes appear to be interpreted so as to permit commercial trade in protected species. For example, trade in traditional medicine appears to be regarded as falling under heritage conservation. Article 28 of the law also outlines a mechanism through which captive populations of some protected species may be traded commercially if the species is added to what's called a utilization list. Now, that list currently contains around 9 species of terrestrial wildlife, but others could be added to it. And that would mean that while the species is protected, captive populations may be treated as non-protected species. And also Article 30 of the law, importantly, it specifies that production and trade of wildlife that is under special state protection may not be sold and traded as food. So that was the state of the law as we came into 2020. What has changed since the emergence of COVID-19? The first major significant policy change I'd like to talk about is on the 26th of January, 3 government agencies, those were the State Administration for Market Regulation, the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Affairs, and the National Forestry and Grasslands Administration. They issued a joint notification, quote, regarding prohibition of trade in wildlife. Now, this notification was temporary. It stated that it was in effect, quote, until the epidemic situation is resolved nationwide. This required facilities keeping wildlife in captivity to quarantine. And it also stated that all business operations, it stated named agricultural produce markets, supermarkets, food and beverage sellers, and online sales platforms shall strictly prohibit trade in wildlife in any form. At the time, it was unclear exactly what was covered by this, even though it stated trade in wildlife in any form. A lot of what that actually covered depends upon how you define wildlife trade. For example, was use of wildlife in traditional medicine covered? Now, this move specifically came about in response to the emergence of COVID-19. The preamble of the notification itself says it was issued, quote, in order to strictly guard against the epidemic in the new type coronavirus and obstruct possible sources and routes of transmission. So this, back in January, was a major, albeit temporary policy shift in direct response to COVID. So following this, on the 24th of February 2020, decisions were adopted by the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress on Wildlife Trade. So the National People's Congress is the highest lawmaking body in China, and they can adopt decisions that will be in effect immediately. These decisions prohibited the breeding and trade of most terrestrial wild animal species for the purposes of consumption as food. Contrary to some media coverage at the time, this was not a total ban on wildlife trade. However, it was a significant policy change. The key difference to the provisions of the wildlife protection law that had been in effect was that this move banned commercial breeding and trade in almost all terrestrial wild animal species. Previously, under the wildlife protection law, trade for consumption as food was only prohibited for protected species. So this extended this prohibition to a huge number of terrestrial wildlife species. A few things to consider here. Of course, the new policy needs to be implemented in an ethical way, and some questions remain. For example, what is happening to the live animals that are held in farms and breeding facilities? How will their welfare be considered? How will the government implement compensation and retraining for people who have invested in wildlife breeding in an industry that had until this point been legal and encouraged? I don't believe that these are necessarily reasons to hold back from banning the trade of wildlife for consumption as food, but these and other issues do need to be tackled in an ethical, transparent and expedient way. And it needs to be done in consultation with relevant experts and stakeholders, both for in the interest of the people involved, of the wildlife held in farms, and also for the effectiveness and the effectiveness of the policy going forwards. So this new February policy was not a total ban on trade in wild animal species. It was primarily focused on trade for food. So what was left out? Firstly, aquatic wild animal species were not covered under this ban. For example, turtles and giant salamanders are commercially bred and traded in large quantities in China. These did not come under this new prohibition. There was a language in the notification stated that some species would be regulated as livestock. This would mean that for species on a livestock list, the captive bred populations that met various criteria could still be traded as they essentially aren't regarded as wildlife. So there's an ongoing consultation process right now to determine what exactly these species will be, but the current list includes what might be described as familiar livestock around the world, such as pigs, cattle, sheep, horses, donkeys, a range of wildfowl and poultry, also some species of deer, guinea fowl, pheasants, partridges, ostriches. Also, some fur animals are included on this list, on the draft list as it stands. So mink, foxes, and raccoon dogs could still be bred and traded commercially for their fur. Crucially, the ban from February 2020 did not cover breeding and trade for non-food purposes, such as pets, ornamental items, and traditional medicine. Specifically, the text of the decision stated, quote, "Where there is a need to utilize wildlife for special purposes other than consumption as food, such as scientific research, medicine, or display, this shall be subject to strict supervision and approval, quarantine and inspection in accordance with relevant national regulations." So the exemption for medicine was written into these February decisions. And effectively, these other forms of trade remain subject to the provisions of the wildlife protection law. As we've explored already, that law permits commercial trade even in protected species. I'd like to just focus on leopards here as a case study to really understand what is currently permitted under the wildlife protection law. Leopards can serve as a good case study as they are under first-class special state protection in China. International trade has been banned since 1975 under the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, CITES. And also leopards are listed as vulnerable by the IUCN, with trade in their body parts a significant threat. Here on the left, maybe able to see my cursor here, this is a tonic wine that is widely available over the counter in pharmacies in China. On the top of the bottle, and also reproduced here on the right, you can see a label issued by a government agency. It was issued under a mechanism that's supposed to ensure the traceability and legality of products that are sold commercially and which contain body parts of protected species. If you can read Chinese, you can see here on the label the characters Baogu, leopard bone. So the government issued label here is the CNWM, stands for China National Wildlife Mark Center, specifies that this is a product containing the bones of leopards that is may be traded legally. This was just one of 62 medicinal products that EIA identified through online research for which leopard bone was listed as an ingredient. on several other labels that we saw, the product label specified the leopard bone was sourced from the wild. Possibly of even more concern, one stated that the origin of the leopard bone was unknown. Among the companies that appear to be producing these products are some of the country's biggest traditional medicine manufacturers with branches around the world. So in this case, we're talking seriously big business, not subsistence. Obviously, there are a range of actors involved, but there are some very, very big companies selling leopard bone products. Now, the continuing trade in leopard bones for use in traditional medicine raises a number of issues. Firstly, there's no transparency around where the leopard bone in trade came from. Government agencies have stated that the leopard bone and also pangolin scales and other body parts of threatened species in legal trade come from registered stockpiles, but there is no transparency around the origin of these stockpiles, the quantities that were held at the point of registration, or what quantities are held after years of presumed depletion and use, or the number of permits that have been issued for their use. So there are fewer than 450 wild leopards in China, and international trade has been banned since 1975. So this begs the question, where has this leopard bone come from in these stockpiles? There are a lot of questions to be answered there. The government has stated that since 2006, pharmaceutical companies have only been allowed to use up existing stock of leopard bone, but the stock that was held in 2006 was never made public. And moreover, through our research, we've documented how registration and procurement of leopard bone has in fact been allowed to continue after 2006. As an example, one permit issued in 2018 allowed a pharmaceutical company to buy 1.23 tons of leopard bone. This is procurement many years after this 2006 sealing up of the stockpile, supposedly, and representing the bones of around 150 leopards. This is against a backdrop of rampant poaching threatening Asian leopard populations. Leopards have disappeared already from around 85% of their Asian range. Several Asian subspecies are critically endangered. And since the year 2000, more than 5,300 Asian leopards have been seized from illegal trade. So here we have a situation in which China has been identified as the primary source of demand for leopards in trade, and yet the official policy is still one of legitimizing the use of leopard body parts in commercially traded traditional medicine products. There's a similar situation ongoing with pangolin scales. The consumption of pangolins for meat is prohibited by the wildlife protection law and has been for some time, by virtue of them being a protected species and the law stating you cannot trade protected species for food. However, the scales of pangolins are still used in legal trade. These are the most heavily trafficked mammal that are extremely threatened across their African and Asian range. And China is a primary consumer country and heavily implicated in illegal trade. The scales that are in legal trade domestically within China are stated, once again, to come from registered stockpiles. But again, there's no transparency around quantities, provenance, or levels of depletion of these stockpiles. So for leopards, pangolins, and many other species, there are serious concerns that the current legal mechanisms and the legal market, combined with a lack of transparency, could be enabling the laundering of illegally sourced and possibly trafficked specimens onto this legal market. Now, even if there isn't laundering happening, and even if the products of a threatened species in legal trade are sourced from captivity, this still risks exacerbating illegal trade by legitimizing and perpetuating demand for these products. This is particularly of concern where there is a consumer preference for the wild source product if the consumer can access it. For example, the bile of black bears held in captivity can be legally used in production of traditional medicines. Here on the bottom left here, we can see a product that contains bear bile as specified by the government label. Bile farming is, of course, a well-known and highly controversial issue due to serious animal welfare and cruelty issues, and also the risk that the legal trade in farmed bear bile is perpetuating demand for for wild bears and hampering efforts to reduce the demand and trafficking. The skins of captive bred tigers can also be legally processed and sold. Here on the bottom right, you can see a picture from 2012 alongside the permit that was issued. This is a reminder that, as well as traditional medicine, the sale of ornamental items made from protected species can also be allowed in China. So that, again, was not covered by these bans brought in February. There's ongoing ambiguity around the legality of use of the bones of captive bred tigers and the horns of captive bred rhinos in trade. There had been a ban in place since 1993 that was repealed in 2018. Government spokespersons then indicated this new policy allowing some use in registered hospitals was not going to be implemented, but that has not been repealed, and that policy that states it may be allowed is still listed on government websites without any qualification as a valid policy. So a lack of clarity for those species right now. Just a side point to note as well, tigers and leopards are subject to first-class special state protection in China, so that's the highest level of protection afforded by the law. This means that even if a species is upgraded to the highest level, as has been proposed for Chinese pangolins, which are currently second-class state protection, that does not mean an automatic end to commercial trade in that species. The law allows commercial trade in wildlife species even under the highest levels of protection. So to address this requires broader amendments to the law. I think it's really important that we recognize for many years there have been a range of voices within China calling for greater restrictions to wildlife trade and a shift to a less consumptive approach. And the kind of legal utilization, legal trade policies that I've described so far by no means are supported by all government agencies, everybody in government, and certainly not by all members of the public. Lots of these kind of calls for greater restrictions have been repeated and amplified in the wake of COVID. For example, there was in January an open letter signed by 19 academics calling for an end to all use of protected wildlife and for transparency, so for open publication of information relating to licensing. After this, in March, a letter was published in the journal Science from Chinese academics who were calling for the ban on wildlife consumption to be extended to traditional medicine. And we've seen similar calls from leading Chinese NGOs since. Meanwhile, at the same time, we should note that most traditional Chinese medicine does not contain any body parts of threatened wildlife. So traditional medicine as a whole is not the problem. What we're talking about is replacing certain ingredients within formulations with sustainable herbal or artificial alternatives. And in fact, many leaders in traditional Chinese medicine are already calling for these changes. We've seen, for example, professors suggesting what herbal ingredients could be used instead of pangolin scales. So many practitioners and academics in traditional Chinese medicine recognize that ending use of wildlife in traditional medicine would be win-win for biodiversity and for the international image of the practice. So looking forwards, as I mentioned, the wildlife protection law is due to be revised again in 2020. This was announced back in February and the revision could be finalized in May. It may currently be expected that the revision will reflect the policy changes we've already talked about. So the content of the National People's Congress decisions focusing on trade in terrestrial wild animals for food, but it's not yet set in stone. So here we have a narrow window of opportunity for lawmakers to amend the law to ban the trade in and use of protected species for other purposes. So as well, like traditional medicine and including from captive sources. So extending the prohibitions beyond just consumption as food. This would represent a much needed precautionary approach to wildlife trade. This is particularly crucial and timely for several reasons. Firstly, given the circumstances that have brought about the change we've seen so far, namely concerns around risks to human health posed by contact with and trade in wild animal species. Obviously, the specific risk of pathogen crossover events may vary by species and the nature of the trade, such as whether animals are live, whether there are multiple species or a single species in one place. But so far, the government has demonstrated a precautionary approach by addressing farming and consumption of food of almost all terrestrial wild animals. So by not extending this same approach to other forms of consumption and farming, processing, consumption, the whole trade chain, not extending this to medicine and other purposes risks undermining the coherence of this policy shift. Also, a new commitment to reducing demand for wildlife species that are threatened by trade, underpinned by these bans, but also backed up by investment in enforcement, education, provision of alternative livelihoods, and evidence-based behavior change campaigns. This could be a game changer in tackling the global illegal wildlife trade. And by addressing this concern, the impacts of global illegal wildlife trade, this could help to mitigate the biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse, which are in turn identified as a driver of pandemics. So it would help this human health focused policy shift in two different ways. So to recap, the Chinese government has already adopted significant and progressive policy changes in the wake of COVID-19. That should be recognized. And if implemented effectively and ethically, these changes could be a real step forward in tackling unsustainable trade in wild animals. If, however, extended to cover other forms of consumption, such as traditional medicine, this would see this policy be progressive and coherent, and it would see China really step up as a global leader in conservation. As Li Shuo is going to discuss, setting this kind of progressive example, I believe, could set the stage for a more successful convention on biological diversity. And China thereby could be setting an example for other countries to follow with meaningful policy changes backed up by political will and investment. And I sincerely hope that this will happen in 2020. Just a few final thoughts on what we at EIA are doing and what maybe stakeholders elsewhere might want to consider. Firstly, we have prepared detailed recommendations for the wildlife protection law revision and various associated regulations. And we will continue to support calls from within China for progressive change. Our recommendations and all of these documents are available in English and Chinese, so please get in touch if you'd like to read them. While the topic of the discussion today is China, this issue is not just about China. It's clear now more than ever that no one country's biodiversity and environmental policies exist in isolation. So globally, we need to be recalibrating our relationship with the natural world. We need to be moving rapidly away from an exploitative and consumptive attitude and towards a fairer and more sustainable way of living. To this end, EIA has joined the Endemics Alliance. This is an alliance that's seeking participation from multiple disciplines, so not just NGOs, but health experts, the tech sector, forestry, all different kinds of backgrounds to together envisage a more sustainable way forwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aaron. Thank you so much. We have already received a lot of questions, and so I'm working on. Thank you, everyone, for all the questions you're raising already. I suggest we move to Shuo's presentation directly, and we try to address all the questions together during the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Alex. I hope you guys can hear me okay, and also can see my slides. Let me start by thanking you and all the colleagues at IDRI for inviting me again. As you said last time, for a webinar on climate change, and this time on the very important issue of biodiversity protection. These two issues are indeed the most pressing global environmental challenges. I only have 3 slides, and I wanted to keep my opening remarks rather brief to give everybody a light touch on the 2 topics that we are discussing today. First one on China's wildlife management reform, and then the second one regarding the CBD COP15. And I very much hope that this opening remarks can help tee up for a deeper dive in these issues. We all know now that it is highly suspected that the new coronavirus, was transmitted, from wild animals to human. So in a way, the profound health crisis that is in front of us is a direct result of the imbalance between human and nature. And I think as a result of that, COVID-19 has, in the past few months, triggered a very vibrant discussion in China regarding how we should tighten up our management on wildlife, and also to better protect our ecosystem. It has certainly opened up space, as Aaron has already mentioned, for further conversation and further progress, on the nature protection agenda. Again, as Aaron has already mentioned, this at this stage has primarily been reflected on the ban that the Standing Committee of China's National People's Congress has introduced in February on all the wildlife trade as a source of food. China has also, embarked on an amendment process for its, wildlife protection law. This law was actually only recently amended in 2016 and 17, and we anticipate that the new amendment should be finalized within this year. One thing that I want to highlight, and this is probably important for the international audience, and also not specifically confined in the species protection field, is a fundamental principle that the amendment process needs to consider, and that is the balance, or rather the rebalance between conservation and the utilization of natural resources. This, should, this dichotomy should definitely be reconsidered very carefully in the amendment. As your audience may know, this dichotomy is also one that is central in many international treaties and instruments regulating, wild animals or the environment. We are also observing over the past few weeks, of course, tighter enforcement on some of the existing rules and regulations in terms of protecting wild animals. I want to highlight one important point, which is when it comes to wildlife protection in China, this has always been a very complex issue in the Chinese context. It is, of course, an environmental story. And now, in light of COVID-19, it has become a health story as well. But it is also an economic and livelihood story in China. Just one number, the breeding industry for wildlife or wild animal in China is a 520 billion RMB industry. That's about roughly 70 billion euro a year. So it is certainly also an industrial and economic story. And there are people's livelihood that are on the line. As some of your audience has already raised questions on enforcement, and implementation, this is certainly also a governance question. How can some of the rules be actually, enforced on the ground? So, I just want to make this I think important point about the complexity of this issue and the urgency to act, because the political and the public window of opportunity might indeed not be very wide. The wildlife reform agenda certainly coincides with a very important multilateral environmental process that China will preside. And of course, that process is the COP15 of the Convention on biological diversity. COP15 is going to be a major milestone for the CBD. Among other important tasks, this meeting will need to outline a global biodiversity protection plan for the new decade. This meeting is also the first time that the Chinese government will chair a rather high-profile environmental process, and therefore will be a key test to Chinese environmental diplomacy. COVID-19 has obviously brought a lot of uncertainties to the ongoing CBD process. But given the role of the CBD in strengthening the global endeavor of protecting nature, the current pandemic has in a way made COP15 even more relevant than before. So we believe there is a need now in light of COVID-19 to reimagine the COP so that it can join the endeavor to help the global community in preventing future pandemics like the one that we are experiencing now. Let me just briefly talk about a few challenges and problems that we have observed in the current COP15 Kunming process. As Greenpeace, the way that we see Kunming should deliver is that it should deliver three major components. Number one, a set of post-2020 biodiversity protection targets. Number two, a robust implementation mechanism to actually make sure the targets are enforced. And number three, rich countries need to support the biodiversity protection efforts of vulnerable countries. These three components are mutually reinforcing and should be dealt with in a balanced manner. And it is our concern now in the negotiation process that it seems the process is paying a lot of attention on how the targets should be designed at the expense of the other two critical components. And in our view, target design, again, is a very, very important piece. But it only tells us where we need to be in 10 years' time, but not necessarily guarantee how do we actually get there. On target, let me just say one more thing as our observation. We tend to observe that in the current Kunming negotiation, that a lot of attention has been paid on the editorial aspect of target design, meaning how should we write or craft different targets. But not enough attention, in our view, has been devoted to how to actually change the underlying political conditions for the fulfillment of these targets. Moving to implementation, let me just tell everybody one very important fact. Before the Kunming conference, under the CBD, there was a set of decadal biodiversity protection targets, the so-called Aichi targets. Not a lot of countries have actually adopted these Aichi targets and translated them back as their domestic targets. So it is, a bit of a no-brainer that, after 10 years' time, we reconvened in Kunming, and we realized that many of the Aichi targets are not fulfilled because they were not, sufficiently owned in the first place by different countries. So a very important call from our side this time around is that once all the Kunming targets are adopted, all the countries need to sufficiently respond to every single one of those targets. For example, if one Kunming target says by 2030, at least 30% of the terrestrial and and ocean should be protected. Every single country needs to come up with an answer to the percentage in their own jurisdiction. We feel like that's the only way to ensure the sufficient implementation of the Kunming vision. And lastly, on support and finance, I think everybody would agree that to tackle the profound biodiversity challenges, very large scale of resource mobilization is needed. And this should include both public and other sources of resource, both domestic resource, but also international aid. And we should also discuss not only how to increase the overall scale of resource, but also how to enhance the efficiency of spending, as well as avoiding the need for some of the resource in the first place. One thing that concerns us here is some of the countries seem to be more interested in the negotiation in talking about how others should provide the support and finance. We tend to see governments talking a lot about how the private sector should change, which is very important. But I think it is also important to remind everybody that the CBD is ultimately a convention of national governments. So it is these governments who are accountable to the Kunming outcome. And that's why I think a very important piece of the discussion that is lacking, that should catch up immediately, is to talk about how to mobilize public resource, both domestic and international. Let me just conclude, moving to my last slide, with a few open questions in terms of how the COP15 can be reimagined in light of the pandemic. I think the first thing that the audience might be aware of is some of the preparatory meetings for the Kunming COP needs to be rearranged as a result of the lockdown imposed by different countries. So I think there is a very important need to consider how the rearranged Kunming calendar, how the new choreography can help contribute momentum all the way to the COP. And secondly, there is a need to reframe the COP and to create new narratives, not only to make the COP more relevant in a post-COVID-19 world, but also to actively embrace what the CBD and the COP can do to contribute to the global effort of preventing future outbreaks. And number three, and this is trying to connect both the CBD topic today, but also the Chinese domestic wildlife management reform. What could be the commitments from China that the country can bring forward to the COP to contribute momentum and to use the COP as an opportunity to catalyze domestic progress? We should, of course, also rethink the issue of finance and support. I cannot stress enough of the importance of this issue. Countries now are spending billions, even trillions, to revive their economy. And in this context, maybe it is worth considering the relatively small amount of resource that we are putting into conservation as an investment, or even
Sorry, everyone. I'm going to write to Shuo quickly.
Body for biodiversity
Shuo,
to look into how yes.
You froze for about 20 seconds, 30 seconds ago. Could you start again on the point on your, maybe at the end of your point on how to rethink finance and support?
Sure. So I think everybody realizes now that countries and governments are throwing in billions or even trillions. Sorry, can you guys hear me okay now?
Yes, you're back.
Okay, right. So countries are spending billions or even trillions to revive their economy. And I think in this context, it is probably worth considering the relatively small amount of money that we are putting into conservation and nature protection as an investment or even an insurance to prevent future pandemics and outbreaks. And very lastly, I think we should also explore different ways to directly integrate the health angle into the post-2020 framework and into COP15. I realize that the German government has already asked the IBES, which is the biodiversity scientific body, to look into existing scientific studies on nature protection and its role in preventing pandemics. And I think further thoughts down this direction would be needed to make to justify the importance of COP15. So let me just leave it here. Thanks very much again for inviting me, and very much looking forward to the discussions.
Thank you so much to you, Shuo. We have a lot of questions, so thanks to you two guys. And I'm trying to organize them, but everything is very interesting. There's a cluster of questions I would like to start with, because it's I think it's really cross-cutting to both of your presentations. There are people asking for a bit more precision and clarity, and maybe examples around the specific challenges of implementation. Saying, for instance, that new policy or legal developments are good, but have we seen any progress, for example, on the resources, human resources, financial resources put on the ground to implement these new developments? And so could you list the challenges that you know of and foresee, and maybe some evolution on that aspect?
One thing that comes to mind personally is when it comes to enforcement and implementation of environmental policies, I think we've seen quite a lot of progress in recent years in China. If we look at illegal wildlife trade, for example, wildlife smuggling, we've seen some really exemplary work from agencies such as the Anti-Smuggling Bureau of China Customs and various local forestry police agencies, police bureaus. We've seen some advanced investigation techniques, for example, tracking phone records, tracking contact on social media to map out networks who are illegally trading in wildlife. So the capacity is there. I believe it's growing, and I think it is underpinned by a degree of political will. So Chinese government agencies essentially have shown that this can be done, and there is a will to do it. A few issues that are particular to the current situation, as I touched on in my presentation, this new ban on breeding and trading in wildlife as food has put a lot of people in a situation where suddenly what they have been doing with the support of the government, something that was legal, is now illegal. And it's important that this is implemented in a way that takes those livelihoods into consideration, that these people aren't criminalized and instead are given alternative routes, alternative training into new livelihoods. So there are complexities, but I think that the government so far has shown a willingness and an ability to take enforcement of environmental laws seriously. And I hope that this will progress. But as I said, it needs to be, implementation needs to be developed in consultation with various stakeholders, with the interests of the people affected and also the animals and the wildlife affected, not a reason to not go ahead with progressive policy changes, but the reality on the ground and the implications need to be considered from the outset.
Thanks. Shuo?
Yeah, thanks. Let me just add a few more thoughts. I think, you know, when it comes to implementation, it is certainly a recurring theme in environmental protection in China. This is a big country when it comes to wildlife protection, which requires a very high level of local grassroots level cooperation. The enforcement or implementation deficit becomes more evident. So there is definitely going to be a need to strengthen the capacity. This is not only financial capacity, but the human capacity of some of the supervisory bodies within the Chinese government at the local level. As Aaron mentioned, one challenge here is indeed the livelihood of the local agricultural community, which should certainly not be dismissed. So in climate change, we talk a lot about a just transition from the gray industry to the green industry. That framing applies here when it comes to moving some of the Chinese agricultural community gradually from wildlife breeding to other sources of businesses. Let me also point out one interesting aspect of the current wildlife protection law. There is something that we call in Chinese a referee player in one dynamic that is enshrined in the current wildlife protection law. What is meant by that is that on one hand, we have the State Forestry Administration, who is the primary ministry to oversee wildlife management. But on the other hand, the State Forestry Administration also happens to be the one who are providing permits, for example, or licenses for animal breeding or hunting. So in a way, you have a conflict of interest here. In one agency doing both protection and also utilization. And I think this issue needs to be addressed in the amendment of the law to ensure that we can have better oversight and implementation.
Alex, I think you might be still on mute.
Thank you. Yeah, do you know the very specific question? There are a few very specific questions on the question on the issue of wildlife trade. I propose that, so I'm getting a little bit a hold of the diversity of questions, and thank you so much, everyone. Questions keep coming, and I'm trying to organize them on the go. We still have half an hour, so don't hesitate. For now, I see three big clusters. There's a specific wildlife trade cluster of questions with some more specific points. There's also a broader set of questions on the dynamics in China, and one which is then the last one, more related to, let's say, broader international dynamics and the questions around COP15. So I'll start with the more specific questions, and I'll around wildlife trade, and I'll throw them to you, Aaron and Shuo, and you address the ones that you want or can. There's a question that is asking, but why did it take so long? So this comes back to the implementation issue, but we know there was the SARS in 2003, for example, that was already an alert on around these issues. So why do you think it took so long? One that I think there was a question specific to which was really related to Shuo's presentation. Do you know, or are there estimates of the costs to the wildlife economy of the current policy developments? That would also give probably an idea of why implementation could be hard, or if the costs are tremendous, because as you mentioned, Shuo, this is a very big industry. And it's a question that I think is related to that, is whether you think there's a risk for black market development if stronger restrictions are put in place. And there's a question on whether you think that the focus that we have in international media coverage, especially, that is focusing really a lot on the wet markets. There was a specific question on, do you think it's too restrictive of a framing? I think, given your presentations, I think we know the answer, but it would be good to hear your view on that. I'll stop on this cluster for now, and hear you guys first before jumping to the rest.
Yeah, if I could just talk to the question on wet markets. I've been following this issue closely, particularly in Western media, and there's definitely a lot of conflation going on between the terms wet market and wildlife market. It's important that people who are calling for change understand what the terms mean that they're talking about. A wet market is, in Chinese, it's just shitang, it's just market. It's a fresh produce market, most of which don't sell wildlife. Some, for example, the Huanan market in Wuhan did have a section selling wildlife, and also that's not to say that welfare and hygiene issues in markets selling domestic produce, in selling domesticated animals shouldn't also be put under the spotlight. But the calls to close down all wet markets are misguided. We should be talking about ending unsustainable, cruel trade in wildlife and trade that poses a threat to human health, and of course talking about reform in the farming sector, in livestock production, but not calling for an end in all wet markets. Related to this is, if the policy focus and if the discussion is only around markets, around physical markets where wildlife is sold, that misses so many elements of illegal, unsustainable, and unsafe wildlife trade that also need to be addressed. So, for example, a lot of the species that we focus on at EIA, such as tigers, pangolins, rhinos, most of these products may be sold online. They may be, for example, traders using WeChat to advertise their products to customers, and then they may be dispatched by express mail, and there may never be a physical market. There may never be a kind of physical presentation of these goods. Also, in the case of food, trade for food, often an animal may be taken directly to a restaurant, for example. There may be a network of traders and restaurants, and again, there's no wholesale market. So all of these other elements of wildlife trade really need to be considered, and when they're illegal, it needs to be enforced against. When they are currently legal but insufficiently regulated and posing a threat to human health and biodiversity, those policies need to be looked at very closely. But we mustn't lose sight of the complexity of wildlife trade and the myriad threats that it may pose to biodiversity and human health. And there was another question on whether a ban might create a black market. I think, firstly, there is already a black market. There is currently there is legal trade in pangolin scales, for example. That does not mean there is not a vast and very problematic illegal trade in pangolin scales. Similarly, with trade in wildlife for meat, even if a species is not protected, there are some regulatory constraints around how that trade should be happening, and frequently that doesn't happen. We have a situation where almost all in every case, you have a legal trade in wildlife, especially wildlife that is threatened. You also have an illegal trade. So it's not a case of necessarily creating a black market. It's what would the impact be on the existing black market or unregulated grey markets. We shouldn't underestimate the impact on demand that a ban can have. Studies after China implemented a ban on ivory trade in 2017 found that a lot of consumers would be put off buying ivory because it was banned. So most people are law-abiding citizens. So if something is banned and they are informed of that, informed of the consequences of flouting it, and it's explained why it's going to be banned so that people can buy into this reasoning, then that can put off a lot of consumers. Also, if there's an element of availability, if something is readily available in a shop, in a legitimate pharmacy, for example, there are a lot of people who might buy that who would not go to the trouble of tracking down clandestine networks on social media to get leopard bone. So, of course, there is persistent demand from some consumers that may not be, certainly wouldn't be immediately ended by bringing in a ban, but it could firstly put off a lot of people from purchasing wildlife that in this participating in this trade that might be posing threats to biodiversity and human health. It could be reducing the quantity, the scale of this trade, and finally, if everything is pushed onto social media, yes, it might be initially challenging, but you also have this opportunity for the tech companies to come in and implement new policies, new algorithms, and to close off that that kind of trade chain as well. So there are challenges posed by things moving on social media, but there are also opportunities as well.
Thanks, Aaron. And we have more specific questions coming after on the business responses also in China. So that maybe you, the example of the tech companies might be you could restart from there maybe at this point. And the Shuo, do you have a series of answers on this group of questions?
Absolutely. Let me just start by reinforcing Aaron's message with regard to wet market. Wet market per se is not the problem. In fact, it is closely linked in many parts of the world with people's livelihood and the way of their life. What could be problematic, of course, is what the markets are selling, right? And if the products are wild, illegal animal products without proper oversight, quarantine, or vaccination, then it could definitely impose a health risk. I want to address the question about the cost. As I said, wildlife breeding is a billion RMB question here in China. The annual profit is 520 billion. And just to introduce one more dimension to this figure, about 3/4 of this overall size of this industry is on animal fur and skin. The rest of the 1/4 is about wild animal as food. And traditional Chinese medicine constitutes a very, very marginal share of this pie. So when it comes to fur and skin, again, this is where demand and consumer behavior can come in. Hopefully this is one way of answering the question that you posed, Alex. Let me also try to address the other question that you had, which is why it took so long and what can be done by that. I think to some extent, political will can help us simplify some of the challenges that we encounter when it comes to local implementation. One challenge, for current implementation is indeed the very ambiguous definition regarding wildlife. What is wildlife and what is not, what is protected and what is not always very clear in the Chinese context. As Aaron alluded to, many species could be considered as wild animal in the first place, but captured and breeded in a human environment. Would that be characterized as still wild animal or breeded animal, right? So as a result of this challenge, there has been many suggestions now in the amendment process of the Chinese wildlife protection law. And one very concrete proposal is to establish a white list. So basically, as opposed to a black list, the white list refers to specific species that can be breeded legally, so that only the species that are on this list can appear, for example, in markets, under the condition, of course, of proper vaccination and quarantine, right? So in a way, broadening the scope of wild animal and to have stronger political will can actually help us simplify the very complex question when it comes to local enforcement. And that is one way that we see can help us ensure stronger implementation on the ground. Over.
And what about the economic costs of reforms to the wildlife industry? Have there been any estimates so far of what it would cost to the industry to have stronger restrictions on trade and or breeding? Or is it still an unknown?
Yeah, as I said, so the existing ban on wild animal as a source of food is about a quarter of the overall breeding industry. So that's about 100 billion RMB per year, which is still a pretty considerable number. Yeah. So indeed, the question here is how to help the local community who are relying on this 100 billion, and to help them to transfer to other sources of income or livelihood.
And what the and in these other options, other sources, and ways to compensate, is there a I would say, are there several options on the table? Is there a debate around these? Like, is it new other forms of agriculture or maybe financial compensation directly?
Yes, there is a discussion on how to compensate the animal breeders whose business has just been basically banned as a result of the February as a result of the policy released in February. So this is indeed going to be a very important question. And I think the outcome of that conversation will also help us determine how far the reform can be pushed forward.
So there's what was very interesting to me is that we tend to have, I think, from far away, a very simplified vision of the issue, and what you two are describing is really, I mean, it really relates to a lot of challenges that you see when you talk about the transition of any sector. So how you have the regulation, but you have also really the very important question of how do you what other types of activities do you promote and support and so forth to really have this shift towards other economic practices. And so I suggest we move to the next cluster, we have 15 minutes left. And there were questions that were you've addressed some bits already, huh? in your answers to the previous set of questions, but I think it's worth delving a little bit more into them. There was a question really on the weight and what civil society can do in China, and is it only I would say restricted to only raising awareness and mobilization, or is there a capacity to do more, maybe even to help implement the decisions? And I would link that to another question on whether there has been a response and somehow an acknowledgement in the business and finance sector around, and especially around the risks related to nature, and whether in the financial investment decisions you can see a shift occurring in China. There was, Aaron, you've addressed it a bit, but there was also a question on, isn't there a specific work to do on the consumer side of the wildlife issue? And there were two questions that are a little bit linked to, I mean, they're linked to international dimensions, but they are very specific to China. One was, when will China implement its ABS, access and benefit sharing regulation? And Aaron, especially on the leopard issue, there was a question whether it meant that China was not respecting CITES provisions around the leopard, if it's still being sold. Yeah, and there was, on the consumer side and also the NGO side, normally in the Q&A you can see, because I answered it, there was, thanks Robin from the FRB in French for sharing this information. That there was, the Shantri Center, which is an important environmental NGO in China, made an online survey with 100,000 answers in 22 days, and 94% of the participants indicated that they would stop consuming wild animal products because of the coronavirus outbreak. So this, I think, is an interesting piece of information to introduce this question of civil society, consumer side, and so forth. The floor is yours, guys.
Yeah, if I could step in. Firstly, that I totally agree. The Peking University and Shanshui, other NGOs, that questionnaire that was done in January is, and the results that again showed the vast majority of people in support of more restrictions on wildlife trade. I believe it's of around 100,000 respondents, 79% would be opposed to use of wildlife in medicine, for example. These kind of findings are really important for all of us to understand that it is absolutely not the case that everybody in China is, thinks in a certain way. It's a country that is incredibly diverse, and there are very many dedicated advocates for the environment working in China, and that, I think, that is an element that's often lost in foreign media coverage. And again, that it seems, by all accounts, the majority of the people in the country would like to see a move towards a less consumptive approach to wildlife. And we've seen this again and again. For example, when the ban on use of rhino horn and tiger bone was lifted in 2018, the 95% of the comments on media articles on Weibo were in opposition of this, saying this is not the right direction, this is bad news. So it seems to me there is a increasing appetite from people within China for change. Obviously, I am not Chinese and I'm not there, so I'd like to hear Li Shuo's opinions on this as well. The question of whether the leopard trade is respecting CITES is an interesting one. Firstly, CITES, as well as the text of the convention, every year resolutions and decisions are adopted, which are adopted by the Conference of the Parties, and they are there to guide the parties in implementing the convention and adapting the convention to be fit for purpose in practice. In 2019, an amendment to the resolution that relates to Asian big cats was adopted, called upon all parties to close down domestic markets for Asian big cat products where it contributes to poaching and illegal trade. I think it's a very, very strong case to be made that China's current legal trade in leopards and tigers does contribute to illegal trade, and we, EIA, have even documented, for example, companies that are involved in the legal trade also offering illegal specimens. And therefore, for China to be respecting CITES, as it were, respecting the will of the CITES parties, those markets should be closed down. On the another side is there are, as I mentioned, a lot of questions to be asked around where the stock came from, as if there are very few wild leopards in China and international trade is banned, where did this stockpile come from that is being traded legally? Now, we don't know that right now, but CITES parties, other countries, should be taking these kind of issues to meetings of CITES, to the Standing Committee, to the Secretariat, and requiring answers and requiring transparency from the permitting agencies to prove if something is from before 1975, to prove this. If it's not, if it can't be proved, if it indeed was originated from, say, leopards that were killed illegally in other countries and were smuggled into the country, then further discussion and consequences should arise from that. But certainly there are, in the immediate term, a lot of questions to be answered from the point of view of the permitting authorities, and a lot of concerns should be being raised, both within China and from other countries. Just finally, to the question of reducing demand and the need to tackle demand in order to tackle consumption and trafficking is obviously absolutely crucial. And I think that's one reason why these regulatory changes and bans and enforcement of those bans are so important. They are not a silver bullet, but they are one important element of a suite of measures that need to be taken to reduce demand. So having a policy that says to the public, it says to practitioners and traders, this is illegal and there will be consequences for contravening these laws, that is backed up by awareness campaigns that explain why these policy changes have been made so that people can get behind them, and also that there are evidence-based behavior change campaigns launched to tackle the persistent demand. That's something that we really have not seen enough of in China at the moment, because these kind of policies to be as effective as they should be need government investment and need to really be coming from the government. So by tidying up these provisions in the law that are, on the one hand, encouraging and legitimizing use of threatened wildlife, while on the other hand we have these progressive policy changes happening and some quite good work in enforcing these laws, the situation at the moment is somewhat incoherent and somewhat contradictory. So it would be very helpful from a demand perspective if the government were to adopt a simpler policy that says if a wildlife species is protected, its consumption and use is illegal. I think it's well recognized that the demand and action to tackle demand is one of the most crucial things that we need to be looking at to tackle the biodiversity crisis and wildlife trade today.
Thanks, Aaron. Shuo, any additions?
Yeah, let me just focus on the question regarding what role can NGOs play. I think one thing for everybody outside from China to know is that in the few weeks after the initial outbreak here in China, I think it is really fair to say that the work of many NGOs here really managed to elevate the wildlife protection agenda to the national level. I mean, we're talking about works, for example, conducted by domestic groups such as Friends of Nature. So really active public awareness work. Many of those groups will be very actively engaged in the amendment portions of the law. And indeed, many of them have already put forward proposals in terms of how the amendment should happen. There is also a role for NGOs to play a watchdog role. And this is partly to complement the government oversight on the ground. And I know many conservation groups are indeed doing such works. Public awareness is indeed very important. Aaron talked about the ivory issue as well as other animal products. I think over the past few years, people in China indeed observe very active public education in this area. As a result of that, also having an impact on the consumer behavior. I think one thing as a reflection that NGOs can do better is to better target the very specific segment of the society that are still using various wild animal products. I think better audience research is needed to be able to really reach the education or the message to these communities. So that's I think one area that probably some better work and further thinking is needed.
Thanks a lot. Let's use the 3-5 last minutes for the last group of questions, and this is also I think a series of questions that are pushing us towards looking forward and in relation to COP15 perspective. There was a set of questions that were asking whether the focus on wildlife only was not too restrictive, because there's the ambiguity between wild animals and wild species that are bred, but also we know from other pandemics that the domesticated animals, the farming in general, is also a big source of pandemic risks. We had that with the 2 last influenza pandemics, for example, in the 2000s. And that habitat destruction, which is strongly related also to agricultural pressure, is also a source of increased contact with potential emerging infectious diseases. So in the context of discussing planetary health, the whole narrative of that we can develop for COP15, how do you think we could try and link these issues together? But also concretely, there was a question on really now, on the way from now to Kunming, what do you see as a sequence, a political sequence, enabling a better linkage of these issues? And lastly, I will finish on that. There was also a very specific question asked on whether the theme of ecological civilization that was chosen for COP15 could also be an opportunity to, at least at the domestic level in China, push for these stronger linkages between biodiversity and I would say planetary health issues more generally.
Yeah, I think I can take a first stab on those questions, if that's fine. I think indeed, domesticated animals, we haven't really talked about that. That's also a very important dimension if we consider preventing future pandemics. Let me just say that part of the reform in China will also need to tackle how to better manage domesticated animals. by, for example, developing standards for vaccination and quarantine. That's definitely going to be on the agenda. And I think here really very surgical management would be needed, which has been lacking in China. Regarding the wildlife protection and COP15, wildlife protection as well as habitat protection, ecosystem protection are indeed issues that will be dealt with at the COP in Kunming. This means various targets will be set. I think when we talk about wildlife protection, sometimes we are talking about that in vacuum. Forgetting that those wildlife actually lives in various habitats and ecosystems. So I think that's going to be a very important angle where the CBD comes in, because targets will be set on protected area and how to protect the habitats. Again, I think let me just also reinforce one of my earlier messages, which is we feel like all the countries in the current CBD negotiations really need to pivot to the critical issue of implementation and support. Again, it is one very important thing to outline the vision. But as we talked about throughout this call, implementation enforcement is as important, if not even more important, than the vision that is on paper. So how do we, in the context of the CBD international negotiation, ensure the global vision can actually be carried through? I think that's a very, very important question, a question that hasn't really received enough attention that it deserves. So in a way, the extended timeline for Kunming provides much more welcomed time and opportunity to rapidly catch up on those issues.
Thanks, Ro.
Yeah, not a huge amount to add there, but just very briefly, I'd say I absolutely agree that focusing in terms of recalibrating what's going to happen in our relationship to nature post-COVID and coming up to the CBD, I agree that a focus only on wildlife trade is too narrow. Obviously, that's the area I work on, so that's where I've been focusing on. But I would like to see this conversation broadened to bring in a lot more expertise from farming, in terms of habitat protection and restoration, and the experiences of indigenous communities. I think all of these perspectives are really important, and we should not miss this opportunity to address all of these other issues, which are crucial both from a planetary health perspective and also in terms of reducing pandemic risk. I've seen some suggestions that banning wildlife trade doesn't work or something like that. I think firstly, we're not talking about banning all wildlife trade. For all of these things and all of these elements, there's not a one-size-fits-all policy. We need to be having conversations with experts and with stakeholders, with people affected. And I think what I've presented today is an example with the case of threatened species, where there's a very strong argument to be made for banning that trade. In general, we should be looking to end and massively restrict trade that is unsustainable or cruel and which presents a risk to human health. But of course, we're not necessarily talking about collecting a sustainable collection of wild herbs, for example. It's not a one-size-fits-all policy. It's looking again at the detail, at the grassroots situation, and figuring out what is the policy that's going to work best and is going to have the most positive impact on biodiversity and human health. But the overall direction that we need to be taking, the big picture, I strongly believe is towards a less exploitative and less consumptive relationship with nature. Wildlife trade is part of this, so is farming, so is habitat destruction, use of natural resources. We need to be moving away from wanton destruction and consumption towards a fairer and sustainable way of living.
Thanks a lot. It's hard to wrap up. We have to close the webinar. We already took a little bit more than what was scheduled. Just to try and sum up, I think first of all, thanks to you two for the clarity of your presentations and the details that you provided. I think we all learned a lot. And from the conversation, I would, and especially the last part, I would say that I think there's a lot in the discussions already on the table for COP15 that indeed relate in a way or another to what's going on now, both in terms of what we need to do on the wildlife management, trade, etc., but more generally on habitat protection. And I would say that in the coming month and year, as you said also, Shuo, we have now more time to do that work. I would say that it's probably very important to stress how important this negotiation is in its different aspects, in these different elements, because some of the answers that we need to tackle the underlying causes of the pandemics are actually being discussed in this arena. And this probably needs to be better highlighted. And as you mentioned, Shuo, I think that from what I heard from your discussion is also that somehow, and we see that in the questions too, that somehow now with half of the planet being in lockdown, the magnitude of the risks are quite clear to a lot of people on Earth. And so the need to indeed have more means on implementation and not leave the text as beautiful as they can be only on paper, but work on how to make them a reality, that I think we can also put more emphasis on how this is maybe even the biggest priority now. So a lot of food for thought and further and future discussions. Thank you so much for being with us. Have a good rest of the day, Aaron. Good evening to you, Shuo. Thanks to everyone who joined. We're still 150 people, and even if we pass the time, so it's a sign of the quality of the discussions you guys provided. So thank you so much for that, and looking forward to future discussions.
Thank you very much for having us, and thanks for all of the questions and the engagement as well.
Thank you.
Thank you guys. Cheers, pal.
谢谢。